a kiss that promised destruction. Isabella Romano had been raised to be untouchable. But when she made a mistake, when she trusted the wrong man, when she let him too close, she realized too late that she had underestimated the game. Now, he sat across from her in the candlelit club, his fingers tapping against his glass, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "You played well, Bella mia," he murmured. "But I don't lose." Chapter 1. The Shadow of Past Mistakes. The rain lashed against the panoramic windows of Isabella Romano's penthouse, mirroring the tempest brewing inside her. From this height, the city of Florence, her city, spread out like a tapestry woven with threads of history, intrigue, and danger. But tonight, the beauty held no solace. The glittering lights blurred, distorted by the streaks of water and the film of unshed tears in her eyes. 5 years. 5 years since she had last seen him, since the night that had shattered her carefully constructed world. Isabella traced the delicate rim of a crystal wineglass, the chilled condensation clinging to her fingertips. The Pinot Grigio, usually a source of comfort, tasted like ash in her mouth. She hadn't touched a drop, the clarity of her mind a fragile shield against the memories threatening to engulf her. She needed to be sharp, to be ready. Tonight, everything changed. She glanced at the antique clock ticking softly on the mantelpiece, its gilded hands inching towards midnight. The meeting had been arranged with a precision that spoke of old-world protocols and deadly consequences. He had requested this rendezvous, a summons disguised as an invitation, and Isabella, despite every instinct screaming at her to flee, had accepted. To refuse would be to admit weakness, a fatal flaw in the world she inhabited. The Romano family was one of the oldest and most powerful in Italy, their influence woven into the very fabric of the nation. Their legitimate businesses, vineyards, luxury hotels, art galleries were a shimmering facade concealing a darker, more ruthless reality. Isabella had been raised in the shadow of this duality, taught to navigate the treacherous currents of power with a grace that belied her age. Her father, Don Alessandro Romano, had groomed her to be his heir, a role she had embraced with a fierce determination, even as it chipped away at her soul. But there was a naivete she had not yet lost. 5 years, one fateful error. Marco Bellini. The name echoed in her mind, a phantom limb that ached with a pain both exquisite and unbearable. He had been charming, charismatic, and utterly irresistible. He'd swept into her life like a summer storm, disrupting the carefully ordered landscape of her existence. He was from a rival family, the Bellinis, a clan known for their ruthlessness and ambition, the perfect forbidden fruit. Their interactions had been a complicated dance of subtle flirtation and power struggles, leaving her breathless. Isabella had known the risks, the inherent danger of any entanglement with the Bellini. Yet, she had allowed herself to be drawn in, seduced by his dark eyes and the intoxicating promise of a love that defied the boundaries of their family's feud. She had believed, with the foolish optimism of youth, that their connection could transcend the ancient hatred that divided them. The memory of their last night together was a shard of glass lodged in her heart. The moon had been a silver sickle in the velvet sky, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and impending doom. They had met in a secluded garden, the ancient stones whispering secrets of generations past. Marco had held her close, his touch sending shivers down her spine, his voice a husky murmur against her ear. He had promised her a future, a life beyond the suffocating constraints of their family's expectations. And she, blinded by love and youthful rebellion, had believed him. She had revealed secrets, vulnerabilities, chinks in the Romano armor that she had guarded with her life. She had trusted him implicitly, a trust that had been shattered with the brutal efficiency of a well-aimed bullet. The betrayal had been swift and devastating. Information she had confided in him had been used against her family, resulting in a series of calculated attacks that had weakened the Romano Empire and cost lives. The realization that Marco had used her, manipulated her love as a weapon, had been a blow that had left her reeling, gasping for breath in a sea of pain and disillusionment. Her father, his face etched with fury and disappointment, had banished her from his sight, sending her away to a secluded estate in Tuscany to reflect on her mistakes. The exile had been both a punishment and a protection. It had allowed her to heal, to rebuild the shattered pieces of her heart and her identity. It had also given her time to plot, to hone her skills, to transform herself from a naive girl into a woman of steel. Now, 5 years later, she was back. Stronger, wiser, and far more dangerous. The news of her father's failing health had drawn her back to Florence, to the heart of the family she had almost destroyed. The dawn was dying, and the vultures were circling, eager to seize control of the Romano Empire. And among them, the most dangerous of all, was Marco Bellini. A soft chime echoed through the apartment, signaling the arrival of her guest. Isabella took a deep breath, her hand instinctively moving to the small, pearl-handled pistol concealed beneath the folds of her silk dress. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a steely resolve. She would not be a victim again. She would face Marco Bellini, not as the lovesick girl he had once manipulated, but as the formidable woman she had become. She walked towards the door, her movements fluid and deliberate, her chin held high. The rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of the past, clearing the path for a future she was determined to control. Tonight, she would confront her past, and in doing so, she would reclaim her future. The shadow of her mistakes would no longer define her. She would be the one casting the shadows now. The game was about to begin, and this time, Isabella Romano intended to win. He had taught her well after all, she wanted to believe. But first, she had to look into his eyes and gauge the lay of the land, see if his charm was just as potent and just as false. The door, thick and heavy with the weight of generations, stood between her and the man who had broken her. She took one final, steadying breath and opened it. Chapter 2. Whispers in a Candlelit Club. He stood in the doorway, framed by the muted light of the hallway, a silhouette that sent a jolt of recognition, and something far more unsettling, through Isabella. Marco Bellini hadn't changed much in 5 years. The same dark, intense eyes, the same sculpted features that had once made her heart ache with longing. But there was a new hardness in his jaw, a subtle weariness around his eyes that hinted at the weight of the world he carried. He was even more devastatingly handsome than she remembered, a dangerous predator disguised in the trappings of a sophisticated gentleman. He wore a charcoal gray suit that molded to his broad shoulders and lean frame, the fabric whispering wealth and power. His dark hair was slightly longer than she recalled, brushed back from his forehead, revealing a faint scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a battle she hadn't witnessed. The scent of his cologne, a familiar blend of sandalwood and citrus, drifted towards her, a subtle assault on her senses that stirred memories she had fought to bury. "Isabella," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent shivers down her spine, despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the changes the years had wrought. He didn't miss the way she held herself, the steely glint in her eyes, the subtle tension in her posture. She closed the door, the heavy thud echoing in the silence of the apartment. "Marco," she replied, her voice cool and controlled, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. She gestured towards the living room, where the city lights glittered through the rain-streaked windows. "I wasn't expecting you to be so punctual." He smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm a man of my word, Isabella, especially when it comes to unfinished business." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, a heavy cloud of past betrayal and lingering resentment. Isabella led him to the seating area, choosing a chair opposite the low sofa, maintaining a strategic distance. She needed to keep her wits about her, to read him, to anticipate his moves. "Wine?" she offered, gesturing towards the untouched bottle on the coffee table. "Thank you, but I'll pass," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "I prefer to keep a clear head when dealing with complex situations." Isabella poured herself a glass of water, her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart. "And what makes you think the situation is complex, Marco?" He leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of him, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Because we both know this isn't a social call, Isabella. We're here to discuss the future. Your father's declining health has created a power vacuum, and we both know the vultures are circling. And you consider yourself one of those vultures? She asked, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. Let's just say I'm interested in maintaining the balance of power. The Bellinis and the Romanos have always had a complicated relationship. We both know that a war between our families would be devastating for everyone involved. So, you're proposing a truce? Isabella asked, her eyes narrowed. After everything that happened? He leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers, the intensity in his eyes almost palpable. I'm proposing a collaboration. A way to ensure that the transition of power is smooth and mutually beneficial. Isabella studied him, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the manipulative charm he had used to betray her 5 years ago. But his expression was unreadable, his eyes guarded. She knew he was dangerous, that he was capable of anything. But she also sensed a flicker of something else, a hint of vulnerability, a weariness that mirrored her own. And what makes you think I would trust you, Marco? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. After you used me, after you betrayed everything she couldn't bring herself to say the word love. It was a wound that was still too raw, too painful. He looked away, his gaze drifting towards the rain-lashed windows, his jaw tight. I know I hurt you, Isabella. And I'm not going to pretend that I can erase the past.
But things are different now.
We're both older, wiser, and perhaps a little more desperate. Desperate? She echoed, her voice sharp. I'm not desperate, Marco. I'm prepared. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of admiration and regret. Prepared to fight? Prepared to lead your family into a war that could destroy everything? Prepared to do whatever it takes to protect what's mine, she said, her voice unwavering. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Then, he nodded slowly, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. I believe you are, he said softly. But perhaps there's a better way. A way to avoid bloodshed. To build something stronger. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He placed it on the coffee table, his gaze never leaving hers. This is a proposal, Isabella. Not just a business arrangement, but a partnership. A way to unite our families, to end the feud that has plagued us for generations. Isabella stared at the box, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what it contained, even before he opened it. A ring. A symbol of alliance, of commitment, of a future she had never dared to imagine. But this was not the romantic gesture of a lovesick boy. This was a strategic move, a calculated play for power. He opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring, the stone glittering in the soft light, reflecting the city lights outside. It was a breathtaking piece of jewelry, a symbol of wealth and power, but it also represented a cage, a gilded prison that could either bind her or set her free. The choice was hers. But the choice was not a simple one. It was a choice between the past and the future, between vengeance and forgiveness, between love and hate. A single tear escaped, trailing down and leaving a wet mark upon the velvet. Think about it, he said, his dark eyes capturing her, keeping her own tears at bay.
For now.
Chapter 3. A legacy forged in secrets. Isabella stared at the ring, its brilliance a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. The proposal was audacious, outrageous, and yet strangely compelling. Marco's words echoed in her mind, a seductive whisper of a future where the Romanos and Bellinis could stand together, united instead of divided. A future where the bloodshed and betrayal that had defined their family's history could finally be laid to rest. But could she trust him? Could she ever truly believe that his motives were anything other than self-serving? The memory of his betrayal was a fresh wound, a constant reminder of the pain he had inflicted. Yet, She couldn't deny the flicker of something else in his eyes, a vulnerability that hinted at a deeper, more complex reality. She looked up at him, her gaze searching, questioning. Why, Marco? Why now, after all these years? He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, a mask of carefully constructed composure. Because the world is changing, Isabella. The old ways are no longer sustainable. We need to adapt, to evolve, or we risk being consumed by the chaos. And you believe that marrying me is the answer? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. He leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of him, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It's a solution, Isabella. A way to merge our strengths, to create a force that no one can challenge. Together, we could control everything. Control, she echoed, the word leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. Is that all you care about, Marco? Power and control? He hesitated, a flicker of something akin to pain crossing his features. It's not just about power, Isabella. It's about legacy. About building something that will last. Something that will transcend the petty feuds and rivalries that have consumed our families for generations. Isabella thought of her father, his failing health, his desperate plea for her to return, to protect the Romano legacy. She thought of the sacrifices he had made, the burdens he had carried, all in the name of family honor. Could she turn her back on that legacy, on the responsibility that had been thrust upon her? But what kind of legacy would it be? A legacy built on lies, on betrayal, on a forced alliance with the man who had broken her heart? Could she ever truly be happy in such a union, even if it meant securing her family's future? She closed her eyes and took a deep, calming breath. She recalled the stories her Nana Emilia used to tell her, tales of the Romano ancestors, of their courage, their resilience, their unwavering loyalty to family. Nana Emilia, a woman of fierce independence and unwavering spirit, had always emphasized the importance of choosing one's own path, of forging one's own destiny. She had instilled some advice that Isabella often revisited. The heart knows its own truth, Cara, Nana Emilia had said, her voice raspy with age, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. Listen to it, even when the world tells you otherwise. For in the end, it is the only voice that truly matters. Isabella opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on Marco. I need time to think, Marco. This is not a decision I can make lightly. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. I understand. Take all the time you need. But remember, Isabella, time is not on our side. The wolves are at the door, and they will not wait forever. He rose to leave, his movements graceful and deliberate. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the ornate handle. One more thing, Isabella, he said, his voice low and intense. I know I hurt you, and I'm not asking you to forget. But I am asking you to consider the possibility that things are not always as they seem. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of regret and something else, something that she couldn't quite decipher. Then, he turned and walked out, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her doubts, and the glittering diamond ring that represented a choice that could change her life forever. She reached out for the ring, turning it slowly, studying its details. There was something about its design, about the way the stone was set, that nagged at her. Something almost familiar. She closed her eyes, thinking, and it came to her. The Romano crest. Or, rather, a variation of it. How had she not seen it before? This was not a simple diamond ring. It was a declaration, one her family would recognize, and one, perhaps, that offered a deeper truth than Marco had explicitly stated. Or one far more dangerous, a warning disguised. She needed answers. And Isabella had a feeling that she wouldn't like the answers. Chapter 4. The Unseen Scars of Betrayal. The silence in the apartment was deafening after Marco's departure, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the windows. Isabella felt drained, emotionally exhausted by the encounter. The weight of his proposal, the implications of a union with the Bellinis, pressed down on her, suffocating her with its complexity. She picked up the velvet box, the diamond ring glittering under the soft light, a beacon of both hope and trepidation. The subtle Romano crest etched into the setting, a detail she had almost missed, nodded her. It was a message, a hidden layer of meaning that she couldn't ignore. Was it a genuine gesture of reconciliation, a symbol of a new beginning? Or was it a trap, a cleverly disguised threat? A reminder of the power the Bellinis held over her family? She needed to talk to someone, to confide in someone who understood the intricacies of her world, the unspoken rules and deadly consequences of the Mafia. But who could she trust? Her father was incapacitated, his mind clouded by illness and medication. Her brothers, while loyal, were too impulsive, too driven by a thirst for revenge to offer objective counsel. There was only one person who came to mind, Zia Emilia, her father's sister, the matriarch of the Romano family, a woman of formidable strength and unwavering wisdom. Zia Emilia had always been a source of comfort and guidance, a confidant who had helped Isabella navigate the treacherous currents of her life. She had been the one who had held Isabella together after Marco's betrayal, who had helped her heal, to rebuild her shattered self-esteem. Isabella grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed Zia Emilia's number. The phone rang several times before a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Isabella?"
Kara, is that you?
"Zia Emilia," Isabella said, her voice choked with emotion. "I need to see you. It's urgent." "Of course, Kara. Come to the villa. I'll be waiting." Isabella hung up the phone, a wave of relief washing over her. Zia Emilia's villa, nestled in the hills overlooking Florence, had always been a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the pressures of her life, where she could be herself, without the masks and pretenses required by her position. She changed quickly, shedding the elegant dress for a pair of dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, a concession to the cold, damp night. She grabbed her keys and a leather jacket, her hand instinctively brushing against the small pistol concealed in her purse. She hadn't carried a weapon in years, but tonight, she felt the need for protection, a tangible reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The drive to Zia Emilia's villa was a blur, the city lights a hazy shimmer through the rain-streaked windshield. Her mind raced, replaying her conversation with Marco, dissecting his words, searching for hidden meanings, for any clue that could help her decipher his true intentions. She pulled into the long, winding driveway, the headlights illuminating the ancient stone walls of the villa, its imposing facade a testament to the Romano family's enduring power. The villa was a fortress, a sanctuary, and a repository of secrets, a place where generations of Romanos had lived, loved, and died. Zia Emilia was waiting for her at the entrance, her tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the interior lights. She embraced Isabella, her strong arms enveloping her in a hug that was both comforting and reassuring. "Come in, Kara," Zia Emilia said, her voice filled with concern. "You look pale. What's happened?" Isabella followed her into the villa, the familiar scent of old wood and beeswax filling her senses, a comforting reminder of her childhood. They settled in the library, a cozy room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fireplace crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Zia Emilia poured them both a glass of grappa, the strong liquor warming Isabella's throat, helping to calm her racing nerves. She took a deep breath and began to tell Zia Emilia everything, recounting her encounter with Marco, his proposal, the hidden crest on the ring, the conflicting emotions that were tearing her apart. Zia Emilia listened patiently, her dark eyes fixed on Isabella, her expression unreadable. When Isabella finished, she remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. "The Bellinis," she said finally, her voice low and thoughtful. "They are a dangerous breed, Isabella. Cunning, ruthless, and ambitious." But she paused, her eyes meeting Isabella's. "They are also pragmatic. They understand the value of alliances, of strategic partnerships." "But Marco, he betrayed me, Zia Emilia," Isabella said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He used me, manipulated me. How can I ever trust him again?" Zia Emilia reached out and took Isabella's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. The past is the past, Kara. We cannot change what has happened, but we can learn from it. We can use it to make us stronger, wiser. But the ring, Isabella said, pulling the velvet box from her purse and showing it to Zia Emilia. The Romano crest, what does it mean? Zia Emilia examined the ring carefully, her fingers tracing the intricate design. It's a variation of our crest, yes, she said, her brow furrowed. But it's also different. There's a subtle addition, a small detail that I've never seen before. She pointed to a tiny, almost imperceptible symbol etched into the base of the crest, a small, stylized flower. This, she said, is a non-ti scordardimi, a forget-me-not. Isabella stared at the tiny flower, a wave of emotion washing over her. A forget-me-not, a symbol of remembrance, of enduring love, of a promise that had been broken. But what did it mean in this context? Was it a genuine apology, a plea for forgiveness? Or was it something more sinister? A reminder of the pain he had inflicted, a threat disguised as a token of affection? She wasn't entirely sure. She hoped the former. He said things were different. Isabella's voice was soft. Zia Emilia looked to her niece. Perhaps, she said. Perhaps he regrets what he did. Perhaps he's changed. Isabella had a decision to make. But now she knew she wasn't alone. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Broken Promise. The forget-me-not. The tiny, delicate flower etched into the ring was a persistent whisper in Isabella's mind, a haunting reminder of the past, and a perplexing enigma for the future. Zia Emilia's words, perhaps he's changed, echoed in her thoughts, offering a sliver of hope, a fragile possibility that Marco Bellini might be capable of redemption. But doubt, like a persistent shadow, clung to her. The scars of his betrayal ran deep, a network of emotional wounds that ached with a dull, throbbing pain. Could she ever truly trust him again? Could she risk opening her heart to the man who had once shattered it so completely? The next few days were a blur of restless nights and anxious days. Isabella found herself drawn to the villa's ancient chapel, a small, secluded sanctuary where generations of Romanos had sought solace and guidance. The scent of incense and candle wax hung heavy in the air, a comforting aroma that evoked memories of her childhood, of whispered prayers and quiet contemplation. She sat in one of the worn wooden pews, the cool stone floor beneath her feet, the stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the walls. She gazed at the altar, the flickering candlelight illuminating the serene face of the Madonna, a symbol of compassion, forgiveness, and unconditional love. She closed her eyes, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She thought of her father, his frail body ravaged by illness, his desperate plea for her to protect the Romano legacy. She thought of Marco, his dark eyes, his seductive charm, the lingering memory of his touch, the intoxicating promise of a love that had turned to ashes. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on a small, wooden carving of a forget-me-not, nestled among the votive candles at the base of the altar. It was an old carving, worn smooth by time and countless hands, a testament to the enduring power of memory, of promises made and broken. A memory surfaced, a fragment of a conversation she had had with Marco, long ago, during their brief, ill-fated romance. They had been walking through a field of wildflowers, the sun warm on their skin, the air filled with the buzzing of bees and the sweet scent of blossoms. Marco had plucked a forget-me-not, its delicate blue petals a vibrant splash of color against his tanned skin. He had tucked it behind her ear, his fingers brushing against her hair, his eyes filled with a tenderness that had made her heart soar. Non ti scordardimi, Isabella, he had said, his voice a husky murmur. Forget-me-not. It had been a promise, a vow of eternal love, a commitment that had been shattered by his betrayal. The memory, once sweet and cherished, now felt like a cruel mockery, a reminder of the pain he had inflicted. But as she sat there, in the quiet sanctuary of the chapel, a new thought began to take shape. Perhaps the forget-me-not on the ring wasn't a mockery, but a plea for forgiveness, a recognition of the pain he had caused, a desperate attempt to reclaim a love that had been lost. She thought of Zia Emilia's words, of the possibility that Marco had changed, that he had matured, that he had learned from his mistakes. She thought of the vulnerability she had glimpsed in his eyes, the weariness that mirrored her own. She knew that forgiving him would not be easy. It would require a leap of faith, a willingness to risk being hurt again. But it would also offer a chance for healing, for closure, for a future free from the bitterness and resentment that had consumed her for so long. She rose from the pew, her legs feeling unsteady, her heart pounding in her chest. She walked towards the altar, her gaze fixed on the small, wooden carving of the forget-me-not. She reached out and touched it, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn contours of the petals. A decision began to form in her mind, a fragile seed of hope taking root in the barren landscape of her heart.
She would give Marco a chance.
Not a blind, unconditional trust, but a cautious, measured opportunity to prove himself, to demonstrate that he was truly worthy of forgiveness. She knew the risk was immense. She would meet with him again, but on her terms, in a place where she felt safe, where she could control the narrative. She would lay out her conditions, her expectations, her boundaries. She would make it clear that she would not tolerate any further deception, any further betrayal. She left the chapel, the cool night air a refreshing contrast to the stifling atmosphere of her internal turmoil. She walked towards the villa, her steps firmer, her resolve strengthened. The future was uncertain, fraught with danger and potential heartbreak. But she was no longer the naive girl Marco had once manipulated. She was Isabella Romano, heir to a powerful legacy, a woman who had learned to survive, to fight, to protect what was hers. She would face the future with courage, with determination, and with a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that perhaps, just perhaps, forgiveness was possible. As she looked toward the future, she caught a glimpse of movement near the gates. Someone was there. Chapter 6. The Weight of Family Honor. Isabella's heart skipped a beat as she saw the figure lurking near the gates of the villa. The dim light cast long, distorted shadows, making it difficult to discern who it was. Instinct took over, years of training and ingrained caution kicking in. She subtly shifted her stance, her hand moving towards the small pistol concealed in her jacket pocket. It had been a long while since she'd truly felt in danger, and the familiarity was unwelcome. As she drew closer, squinting against the darkness, the figure began to take shape. It was a man, tall and lean, his posture tense, his face obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching her, a silent sentinel in the night. Recognition dawned slowly, accompanied by a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief, annoyance, and a flicker of something warmer, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It was Alessandro, her younger brother, the most impulsive and reckless of the Romano siblings. "Alessandro," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "What are you doing here? You scared me half to death." He stepped forward, the moonlight illuminating his features, revealing a mixture of concern and defiance in his dark eyes. He was a younger, more volatile version of their father, with the same fiery temper and unwavering loyalty to the family. "I came to see you, Isabella," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I heard about Bellini, about his proposition." Isabella sighed, a wave of weariness washing over her. News traveled fast in their world, secrets were impossible to keep, and alliances shifted like the sands of the desert. "How did you hear?" she asked, knowing the answer even before he spoke. "The walls have ears, Isabella," he said, his gaze intense. "Especially in our family. Everyone is talking about it." "About the alliance." "It's not an alliance, Alessandro," she said, her voice weary. "It's a proposal, a suggestion. Nothing is decided." He scoffed, a derisive snort that echoed in the quiet night. "A proposal? From a Bellini? Don't be naive, Isabella. They're playing you. They're trying to weaken us, to take control." "I'm not naive, Alessandro," she said, her voice firm. "I'm aware of the risks. But I'm also considering the possibilities. A union with the Bellinis could end the feud, prevent further bloodshed. Blood is thicker than water, Isabella, he said, his voice rising in anger. We can't trust them. They're our enemies. They always have been and they always will be. Things are changing, Alessandro, she said, trying to reason with him, to make him understand the complexities of the situation. The old ways are no longer sustainable. We need to adapt, to find a new path. A new path? By marrying the man who betrayed you? Who humiliated our family? He spat, his eyes flashing with fury. That's not a new path, Isabella. That's a betrayal. A betrayal of everything we stand for. Isabella felt a pang of guilt, a sharp stab of doubt. Alessandro's words echoed her own fears, her own insecurities. Was she making a mistake? Was she allowing her emotions, her lingering feelings for Marco, to cloud her judgment? I haven't made a decision, Alessandro, she said, her voice softer now, trying to bridge the gap between them. I'm just considering all the options. There are no options, Isabella, he said, his voice unwavering. There's only loyalty. Loyalty to our family, to our father, to our legacy. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight, almost painful. Don't do this, Isabella, he pleaded, his voice filled with desperation. Don't betray us. Don't betray our father. Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing the fear, the anger, the unwavering loyalty that burned within him. She understood his concerns, his fierce protectiveness of the family, his hatred of the Bellinis. But she also knew that she couldn't let his emotions, his prejudices, dictate her decisions. She was only starting to see that he knew more than he was letting on. I would never betray our family, Alessandro, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. But I also have to think about the future, about what's best for all of us. She gently pulled her arm from his grasp, her touch lingering for a moment, a silent reassurance. I need you to trust me, Alessandro, she said. I need you to believe that I'm doing what I think is right. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded slowly, a flicker of reluctant understanding in his eyes. I'll try, Isabella, he said, his voice low and grudging. But I'm watching you. And I'm watching him. If he hurts you again, if he betrays us again, I'll kill him myself. The threat hung in the air, heavy and chilling. A reminder of the brutal reality of their world. Isabella knew that Alessandro was capable of carrying out his threat, that his loyalty to the family was absolute, unwavering. I understand, she said, her voice calm, her gaze steady. But I hope it won't come to that. She turned and walked towards the villa, leaving Alessandro standing alone in the darkness, his silhouette a stark reminder of the weight of family honor, of the burden she carried, of the choices she had to make. The weight of his words, however, and the knowledge behind them, stuck with her. He knew something, and she was determined to find out what. Chapter 7. A glimmer of unexpected alliance. The encounter with Alessandro left Isabella shaken, his raw emotion and unwavering loyalty a stark reminder of the stakes involved. His threat against Marco, while unsettling, was also a testament to the fierce protectiveness that bound the Romano family together. But it was his veiled knowledge, the unspoken accusation in his eyes, that truly disturbed her. What did he know? And how did he know it? She needed to clear her head, to find a space where she could think, away from the suffocating pressure of family expectations and the looming shadow of Marco's proposal. She decided to visit the family vineyards, a sprawling estate nestled in the rolling hills of Tuscany, a place where she had spent countless hours as a child, roaming free among the vines, breathing in the earthy scent of the grapes, finding solace in the tranquility of nature. The drive to the vineyards was a welcome escape, the winding roads leading her away from the city into a landscape of breathtaking beauty. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the hills, painting the vineyards in hues of amber and ochre. She parked her car near the old stone farmhouse, the heart of the vineyard operation, a place filled with memories of laughter, of shared meals, of the comforting presence of her family. She walked among the vines, her fingers brushing against the ripening grapes, the leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The air was filled with the sweet, intoxicating scent of the harvest, a reminder of the cycle of life, of the enduring power of nature. As she walked, she noticed a figure standing in the distance, near a small, secluded grove of olive trees. It was a woman, tall and slender, her dark hair cascading down her back, her posture elegant and graceful. Recognition dawned slowly, accompanied by a surge of surprise and a flicker of hope. It was Sophia, Marco Bellini's younger sister. Isabella hesitated, unsure of what to do. Sophia was a virtual stranger, someone she had only met a handful of times, years ago, during the brief, ill-fated period of her relationship with Marco. She had always seemed aloof, distant, a silent observer of the complex dynamics between their families. But as she watched Sophia, she noticed something different about her. There was a sadness in her eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. She seemed lost, alone, a solitary figure in the vast expanse of the vineyards. Isabella decided to approach her, her curiosity overriding her caution. "Sophia?" she said, her voice tentative. Sophia turned, her eyes widening in surprise. "Isabella?" she replied, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I didn't expect to see you here," Isabella said, feeling a sense of awkwardness, of unspoken tension between them. I come here sometimes," Sophia said, her gaze drifting towards the olive trees. "It's peaceful." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. Isabella sensed a shared vulnerability, a connection that transcended the boundaries of their feuding families. "I heard about Marco's proposal," Sophia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Isabella nodded, her gaze meeting Sophia's. "Yes," she said. He surprised me." Sophia looked away, her expression troubled. He can be impulsive," she said, her voice hesitant. "He doesn't always think things through." Isabella sensed a hidden meaning in Sophia's words, a subtle warning, a plea for understanding. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice gentle. Sophia hesitated, her eyes searching Isabella's. He carries a lot of burdens, Isabella," she said, her voice low and intense. He's not always what he seems." Isabella felt a flicker of hope, a sense that Sophia might be an ally, someone who understood the complexities of Marco's character, the hidden depths of his personality. "I know he hurt you, Isabella," Sophia continued, her voice filled with genuine empathy. "And I can't excuse what he did. But I also know that he's not a monster. I'm trying to understand him, Sophia," Isabella said, her voice sincere. "I'm trying to figure out what he wants, what he's truly capable of." Sophia nodded, her eyes meeting Isabella's, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "He wants peace, Isabella," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He wants to end the feud, to build something better." "But at what cost?" Isabella asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Sophia looked away, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Sometimes the cost is high, Isabella," she said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "But sometimes it's worth it." They stood in silence for a long moment, the setting sun casting long shadows across the vineyards. Isabella sensed that Sophia was holding something back, that there was more she wanted to say, but couldn't. "Thank you, Sophia," Isabella said finally, her voice sincere.
For talking to me."
Sophia nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Be careful, Isabella," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Things are not always as they seem. And trust is a fragile thing." With a final, lingering look, she turned and walked away, leaving Isabella alone with her thoughts and with a glimmer of unexpected alliance, a fragile seed of hope in the complex landscape of her world. It seemed, she thought, she had been right about the ring all along. Sophia had confirmed her hunch. But to what end? And what was Alessandro hiding? Chapter 8. Masks and Midnight Confessions. Sophia's cryptic warning, "Things are not always as they seem," lingered in Isabella's mind, adding another layer of complexity to the already tangled web of secrets and suspicions. The encounter at the vineyard had been unexpected, a glimmer of potential alliance in a world dominated by rivalry and distrust. But it had also raised more questions than it had answered. What did Sophia know about Marco's true intentions? What was she trying to protect him from? Or was she trying to protect Isabella? Isabella decided to confront Marco directly, to demand answers, to peel back the layers of deception and reveal the truth beneath. She arranged a meeting, choosing a neutral location, a small, discreet restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of Florence, a place where they could talk without fear of eavesdropping ears. She arrived early, choosing a table in a secluded alcove, her back to the wall, her gaze fixed on the entrance. She needed to be in control, to set the tone, to make it clear that she was not the naive girl he had once manipulated. She sipped on a glass of sparkling water, her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart. Marco arrived precisely on time, his presence filling the small space, his dark eyes searching hers, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension in their depths. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, his demeanor calm and controlled, a mask of carefully constructed composure. "Isabella," he said, his voice low and resonant, a hint of warmth that sent a shiver down her spine, despite her resolve to remain unaffected. "Marco," she replied, her voice cool and measured, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. They sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with unspoken tension, with the weight of their shared history, with the uncertainty of their future. A waiter approached, took their orders, and they each were thankful for something to break the thick tension. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Isabella said, her gaze unwavering, her voice firm. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of hope in their depths. "And?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "And I have questions," she said, her voice sharp. "Questions that need answers before I can even begin to consider anything." "Ask," he said, his expression unreadable, a mask of carefully guarded neutrality. "The ring," she said, her gaze fixed on his. "The forget-me-not. What does it mean, Marco?" He hesitated, a flicker of something crossing his features. Guilt? Regret? She couldn't quite decipher it. "It's a symbol," he said, his voice evasive. "A symbol of remembrance." "Remembrance of what?" She pressed, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. "Of your betrayal? Of the pain you caused?" He looked away, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle on the table. "Of a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A mistake I deeply regret." "And Sophia," Isabella continued, her gaze unwavering. "She said things are not always as they seem." "What did she mean, Marco?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. "Sophia, she worries too much," he said, his voice dismissive, but Isabella sensed a hidden layer of meaning, a subtle warning. "She cares about you, Marco," Isabella said, her voice softer now, sensing a vulnerability beneath his carefully constructed facade. "And she cares about what happens to you." He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of something passing between them. A connection? A shared understanding? "I know," he said, his voice low and intense. "And I appreciate her concern." He hesitated, his eyes dropping. "But I also know that there are things she doesn't understand," he continued, looking at her, direct. "Things that I can't explain." "Try me," Isabella said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling, his gaze locking with hers. "There are forces at play, Isabella," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Forces that are beyond our control. Forces that threaten everything." "What forces?" she asked, her voice sharp, her senses on high alert. He hesitated, his eyes darting around the restaurant, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "The old guard," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The traditionalists. Those who oppose any change, any alliance between our families." "And they threaten you?" Isabella asked, her heart pounding in her chest. He nodded, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "They threaten everything," he said, his voice tight. "Our families, our future, everything." And the ring, she said, the alliance. It is to protect against them. He nodded. It's a way to unite our strengths, to present a united front, to show them that we are not afraid. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw, vulnerable plea. I need you, Isabella, he said, his voice husky with emotion. I need your strength, your courage, your trust. Isabella looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the manipulative charm he had once used to betray her. But all she saw was sincerity, a desperate plea for help, a fragile hope for a future that seemed almost impossible. I need to know the truth, she told him. And you will, he said, his voice a promise, even as a shadow fell across their table. But not here.
Not now.
Chapter 9. The Dance of Deception and Desire. The shadow that fell across their table was not metaphorical. A tall, imposing figure stood silhouetted against the dim light of the restaurant entrance, his presence radiating an aura of menace, of barely controlled power. Isabella recognized him instantly, a chill running down her spine, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. It was Ricardo, Marco's older cousin, a man known for his ruthlessness, his unwavering loyalty to the old ways, and his open hostility towards the Romanos. Ricardo was a staunch traditionalist, a powerful figure within the Bellini family, and a vocal opponent of any alliance with their rivals. Marco's hand tightened around Isabella's, his grip almost painful, his eyes fixed on Ricardo, a mixture of anger and apprehension in their depths. He slowly released her and moved to stand, a protective instinct kicking in. Ricardo, Marco said, his voice calm but firm, a subtle warning in his tone. What a surprise. Ricardo approached the table, his gaze sweeping over Isabella, his expression cold and disdainful. He ignored Marco's implicit challenge, his focus solely on her. Isabella, he said, his voice a low, guttural growl. I heard you were entertaining interesting offers. Isabella met his gaze, her chin held high, her expression composed, betraying none of the fear churning inside her. I'm exploring possibilities, Ricardo, she said, her voice cool and measured, as any responsible leader would. He scoffed, a derisive snort that echoed in the quiet restaurant. Possibilities? With the Bellini? He spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Don't be a fool, Isabella. They're using you. They're trying to weaken us, to take control. I'm not a fool, Ricardo, she said, her voice sharp, her gaze unwavering. And I'm not easily manipulated. Aren't you? He challenged, his eyes narrowed, his lips curled into a sneer. Or are you still blinded by the charms of a man who betrayed you once already? Isabella felt a flush of anger, a hot wave of resentment rising within her. But she kept her composure, her voice calm and controlled. The past is the past, Ricardo, she said. I'm focused on the future, on what's best for my family. Your family? He scoffed. Your family would be turning in their graves if they knew you were considering this abomination. Marco stepped forward, his body tense, his fists clenched. That's enough, Ricardo, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. You're out of line. Ricardo turned his gaze to Marco, his expression filled with contempt. Out of line? He challenged. I'm speaking the truth, Cugino. You're playing a dangerous game. And you're dragging this woman into it. This woman has a name. Ricardo, Isabella said, her voice sharp, her eyes flashing with anger. And she's perfectly capable of making her own decisions. Ricardo ignored her, his focus solely on Marco. This alliance, it's a mistake, he said, his voice low and urgent. It will destroy us. It will destroy everything we stand for. It's a chance, Ricardo, Marco said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. A chance to end the feud, to build something better. Better? Ricardo scoffed. There's nothing better than tradition, than loyalty, than strength. There's peace, Ricardo, Marco said, his voice softer now, a hint of desperation in his tone. There's a future where our families don't have to live in constant fear, in constant conflict. Ricardo stared at Marco for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You're a fool, Marco," he said, his voice low and final. "And you're going to regret this." He turned and walked away, his imposing figure disappearing into the shadows of the restaurant, leaving behind a heavy silence, a palpable sense of unease. Marco turned back to Isabella, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and something else. Something that looked like fear. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said, his voice low and apologetic. "It's not your fault, Marco," Isabella said, her voice softer now, sensing his distress. "He's a powerful enemy," Marco said, his voice tight. "And he's not alone." "I know," Isabella said, her gaze meeting his. "But I'm not afraid of him, Marco. Or anyone else." He reached across the table and took her hand again, his touch sending a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and desire. The dance of deception and desire had begun. "We need to be careful, Isabella," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to trust each other." "Trust," Isabella echoed, the word hanging in the air between them, a fragile bridge across a chasm of doubt and suspicion. She wanted desperately to believe that she had made the right choice, turning down Ricardo and his thinly veiled threats. She squeezed his hand, looking into his eyes, trying to assess his motives. "We need to be honest with each other," she added. He nodded and moved his hand to the side of her face. "I will be," he confirmed, "but we need to leave.
Now."
Chapter 10. Fractured Reflections in a Broken Mirror. Marco's urgency was palpable, a silent alarm bell ringing in Isabella's mind. The encounter with Ricardo had been unsettling, a stark reminder of the forces arrayed against them, of the deep-seated animosity that threatened to derail their fragile alliance. She followed him out, knowing that she shouldn't. They left the restaurant quickly, slipping into the night, the cool air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the confrontation. Marco guided her towards a discreet black car parked a short distance away, a vehicle she hadn't noticed before. He opened the door for her, his hand hovering protectively at her back, a subtle gesture that both reassured and unsettled her. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her voice laced with a hint of suspicion. "Somewhere safe," Marco replied, his voice low and urgent. "Somewhere we can talk without being overheard." He got into the driver's seat, his movements quick and efficient, his eyes scanning the surrounding streets, as if searching for any sign of danger. He started the engine, the powerful car purring to life, a low rumble that echoed in the quiet night. They drove in silence for a while, the city lights blurring past, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Isabella watched Marco, his profile etched against the glow of the dashboard, his jaw tight, his eyes focused on the road ahead. She sensed a hidden turmoil beneath his calm exterior, a struggle between his desire for peace and the weight of the forces opposing him. "Who are these forces, Marco?" Isabella asked finally, breaking the silence, her voice calm but firm. "What are you so afraid of?" He hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "It's complicated, Isabella," he said, his voice evasive. "It's a long story." "I have time," she said, her gaze unwavering, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. "And I deserve answers." He sighed, a sound of resignation, of weariness. "It's the old guard," he said, his voice low and reluctant. "The traditionalists within our family. Those who believe that any alliance with the Romanos is a betrayal." "Ricardo," Isabella said, her voice flat, stating the obvious. Marco nodded, his expression grim.
"He's one of them," he said.
"But he's not the leader. He's just a mouthpiece." "Who is the leader?" Isabella asked, her voice sharp, her senses on high alert. He hesitated again, his eyes darting to the rear-view mirror, as if checking for pursuit. "My uncle, Don Giovanni Bellini," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The name sent a chill down Isabella's spine. Don Giovanni Bellini was a legend, a figure shrouded in mystery and fear, a man known for his ruthlessness, his unwavering adherence to the old ways, and his absolute control over the Bellini family. He was a ghost, a phantom, a force that had shaped Marco's life, a shadow that loomed over their fragile alliance. "Your uncle?" Isabella echoed, her voice incredulous. "But I thought you thought he was dead," Marco finished, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "That's what he wants everyone to believe. He's been in hiding for years, pulling the strings from the shadows."
Why?
Isabella asked, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the revelation. To protect himself, Marco said, his voice tight. "From enemies. From the law. From anyone who threatens his power." "And now he threatens you?" Isabella asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "He sees our alliance as a threat," he said. "A threat to his control, to his legacy." He pulled the car over to the side of the road, stopping beneath the shadow of an ancient stone archway, a secluded spot hidden from the prying eyes of the city. He turned to Isabella, his gaze intense, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like desperation. "I need your help, Isabella," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I need your strength, your courage, your trust." Isabella looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the manipulative charm he had once used to betray her. But all she saw was sincerity, a raw, vulnerable plea for help, a fragile hope for a future that seemed almost impossible. He was afraid, genuinely afraid. "What can I do, Marco?" she asked, her voice softer now, sensing his vulnerability, her own fears momentarily overshadowed by a surge of compassion. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and desire. It was all moving too fast. "We need to find him, Isabella," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to confront him before he destroys everything." They were interrupted by a sudden noise. A car driving too fast, its lights momentarily blinding them. They had been found. Chapter 11. The Price of Trust and Redemption. The headlights, blindingly bright, pierced the darkness, followed by the screech of tires as a car careened around the corner, its trajectory aimed directly at them. Marco reacted instantly, years of ingrained survival instincts kicking in. He threw the car into reverse, the engine roaring in protest, tires spinning as he slammed his foot on the accelerator. They shot backward, narrowly avoiding a collision, the other car swerving wildly, its driver struggling to regain control. Isabella braced herself against the dashboard, her heart pounding in her chest, adrenaline surging through her veins.
"Who was that?"
she gasped, her voice tight with fear. "Ricardo's men," Marco said, his voice grim, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "They must have followed us." He expertly maneuvered the car through the narrow streets, the engine screaming as he pushed it to its limits. The pursuing car, a dark sedan, stayed close behind, its headlights a menacing presence in the darkness. "We need to lose them," Isabella said, her voice calm despite the terror gripping her. She knew these streets, the labyrinthine alleys and hidden passageways of her city, better than most. "I know," Marco said, his voice tight with concentration. "But they're relentless." He took a sharp turn, the car skidding slightly, tires squealing in protest. He navigated the narrow streets with a skill born of desperation, weaving through the maze of ancient buildings, trying to shake off their pursuers. "Turn left here," Isabella said, her voice urgent. "There's a passage that leads to the river." Marco followed her instructions, turning sharply into a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for the car to pass. The walls closed in around them, the darkness deepening, the only light coming from the car's headlights and the faint glow of the moon. They reached the end of the alleyway, emerging onto a narrow embankment overlooking the Arno River. The water shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting the city lights, a scene of deceptive tranquility amidst the chaos. Marco stopped the car, killing the engine and the headlights, plunging them into darkness. They sat in silence for a moment, listening for any sign of their pursuers. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the embankment and their own ragged breathing. "They'll find us," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not if we leave the car," Marco said, his voice determined. He opened his door, stepping out into the cool night air. "Come on." Isabella followed him, her legs feeling unsteady, her heart still pounding in her chest. They moved quickly and quietly, slipping into the shadows of the ancient buildings that lined the riverbank. They found refuge in a small, abandoned boathouse, its wooden structure weathered and worn, its door hanging precariously on its hinges. They slipped inside, the darkness enveloping them, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves. They huddled together in the darkness, listening for any sound, any indication that they had been followed. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building and the distant sounds of the city. "We're trapped," Isabella said, her voice filled with despair. "Not yet," Marco said, his voice firm, his hand reaching out and taking hers, his touch sending a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. He pulled her closer, his body a shield against the darkness, his warmth a comfort in the cold, damp air. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression filled with a strange mixture of regret and tenderness. "I'm sorry, Isabella," he said, his voice low and husky. "I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to put you in danger." "It's not your fault, Marco," she said, her voice softer now, sensing his vulnerability, her own fears momentarily overshadowed by a surge of compassion. He looked away, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the broken window. "It is my fault," he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. I should have known better. I should have protected you." "You couldn't have known," Isabella said, her voice gentle, her hand reaching up and touching his cheek, her fingers tracing the faint scar above his eyebrow. "You can't control everything, Marco." He turned back to her, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze intense, his expression filled with a raw, vulnerable emotion that she hadn't seen before. A tear escaped, slowly, tracing down his cheek, toward her fingers. I made so many mistakes, Isabella," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I hurt you so badly. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Everyone makes mistakes, Marco," she said, her voice soft, her heart aching for him, for the pain he carried, for the burden he bore. "What matters is what you do after. How you learn from them." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face, his eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a longing that mirrored her own. "I want to make amends, Isabella," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I want to earn your trust. I want to start over." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had begun to stream down her cheeks. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a hesitant question. Isabella didn't resist, her own desire overriding her fears, her doubts, her reservations. She closed her eyes, her lips parting, accepting his kiss, a tentative exploration, a fragile promise of a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. The kiss deepened, a surge of passion igniting between them, a flame that had been smoldering for years, buried beneath layers of pain and betrayal. But the moment was shattered by a sudden noise, a crash from outside, followed by the sound of voices, harsh and guttural. They broke apart, their hearts pounding, their eyes wide with fear. They had been found. Again. Chapter 12. Navigating the Labyrinth of Lies. The crash and the guttural voices shattered the fragile intimacy, plunging them back into the brutal reality of their situation. Marco pulled Isabella further into the shadows of the boathouse, his body shielding hers, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "Don't move." He slipped out of the boathouse, his movements silent and swift, disappearing into the night. Isabella remained huddled in the corner, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She strained to hear any sound, any indication of what was happening outside. The voices grew closer, harsh and menacing, speaking in rapid Italian, their words laced with threats and accusations. She recognized Ricardo's voice, his tone filled with a cold, calculated fury. "Find them," he shouted. "They can't have gone far." Isabella held her breath, her body trembling with fear. She knew that if they were found, the consequences would be dire. Ricardo was not a man known for his mercy, and his hatred of the Romanos was legendary. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching the boathouse, the creak of the old wooden planks under their weight. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, her hand reaching for the small pistol concealed in her jacket pocket. But then silence. The footsteps stopped, the voices faded, replaced by a tense, expectant quiet. Isabella waited, her heart pounding, her breath held captive in her lungs. After what seemed like an eternity, Marco reappeared, his face grim, his clothes stained with dirt and grime. He was breathing heavily, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something that looked like anger. "They're gone," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But they'll be back. We need to move.
Now."
He grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the boathouse, leading her back towards the riverbank. They moved quickly and quietly, slipping through the shadows, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the narrow alleyways and hidden passages. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her voice breathless, struggling to keep up with his pace. "To a safe house," Marco replied, his voice tight. "Somewhere they won't find us." They reached a small, unassuming building, tucked away in a quiet side street, its facade unremarkable, its windows dark and shuttered. Marco produced a key, unlocking the door, ushering Isabella inside. The interior was sparsely furnished, but clean and comfortable, a stark contrast to the chaos and danger outside. There was a small living area, a kitchenette, and a bedroom, all bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp. Marco locked the door, securing the bolts, his movements quick and efficient. He turned to Isabella, his gaze intense, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked like guilt. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, his hand reaching out and touching her arm, a gentle gesture that sent a shiver through her. "I'm shaken," Isabella admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm okay." He led her to a small sofa, sitting down beside her, his body close to hers, his warmth a comfort in the tense atmosphere. "I'm sorry, Isabella," he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. I never should have put you in this position. I underestimated the danger." "It's not your fault, Marco," she said, her voice sincere. "You couldn't have known that Ricardo what I should have known," he interrupted, his voice tight. "I know how he is. I know how ruthless he can be." He looked away, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the floor. "This is all my fault," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My obsession with ending the feud. My desire for peace." "It's not an obsession, Marco," Isabella said, her voice gentle, her hand reaching out and touching his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of tension around his eyes. "It's a noble goal, a worthy aspiration." He turned back to her, his eyes meeting hers, his gaze filled with a raw, vulnerable emotion that she hadn't seen before. "But at what cost, Isabella?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "At what cost?" "The cost of trust, maybe," she said softly. She needed answers, and now was the best opportunity. "Tell me everything, Marco. Tell me about your uncle. Tell me about the old guard. Tell me why they hate the Romanos so much." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers, as if weighing the risks, assessing her trustworthiness. He was afraid. But this time, perhaps, it was a different kind of fear. "It's a long story, Isabella," he said. "We have time," she reminded him gently. She was close. She could feel it. He sighed, and started to tell her everything. Chapter 13. Beneath the surface of cold steel. Marco leaned back against the sofa, his gaze distant, his voice low and heavy with the weight of the past. The story he unfolded was a tapestry woven with threads of betrayal, vengeance, and long-held secrets, a dark legacy that had shaped the Bellini family for generations. "It started long before I was born," he began, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. With my father and your father. Isabella listened intently, her heart aching for the young boy who had grown up in the shadow of this bitter feud, the innocent victim of a conflict he hadn't created. They were friends, once, Marco continued, his voice tinged with irony. Partners. They built the Bellini Empire together, side by side. What happened? Isabella asked, her voice gentle, sensing the pain beneath his words. Betrayal, Marco said, his voice flat, his eyes filled with a cold, hard anger. My father, he discovered that your father was skimming profits, stealing from the family. Isabella felt a jolt of surprise, a surge of denial. Her father? A thief? It seemed impossible, unthinkable. But she held her tongue, allowing Marco to continue his story. My father confronted him, Marco said, his voice tight. He demanded an explanation. He threatened to expose him. And? Isabella prompted, her heart pounding in her chest. And your father, he denied it, Marco said, his voice filled with a bitter resentment. He accused my father of lying, of trying to usurp his power. There was a fight, Marco continued, his voice barely above a whisper. A struggle. And my father, he was killed. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Her father a murderer? It was a revelation that shattered her perception of the man she had always admired, the man she had always believed to be honorable and just. The official story, Marco said, his voice laced with sarcasm, was that my father died in an accident. A car crash. But everyone knew the truth. Everyone knew that your father was responsible. But why wasn't he punished? Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Why wasn't he brought to justice? Power, Isabella, Marco said, his voice filled with a cynical bitterness. Influence. Your father, he had connections. He covered it up. He silenced anyone who dared to speak the truth. And your uncle, Isabella said, her voice low, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragmented puzzle. He vowed revenge. Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a grim determination. He swore on my father's grave that he would avenge his death, that he would make your father pay. And he's been plotting ever since, Isabella said, her voice filled with a growing sense of dread. He's been waiting, Marco corrected, his voice tight. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for an opportunity. And our alliance, it threatens his plans, Isabella said, her voice filled with a chilling realization. Marco nodded, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He sees it as a betrayal, he said. A betrayal of my father's memory. A betrayal of the Bellini family. He wants to destroy us, Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. He wants to destroy me, Marco corrected, his voice filled with a self-reproach.
He sees me as weak.
As a traitor. Isabella reached out and took his hand, her touch firm and reassuring. You're not weak, Marco, she said, her voice sincere. You're brave. You're trying to do what's right. You're trying to break the cycle of violence. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a fragile hope, a glimmer of belief in a future that seemed almost impossible. He had just made himself vulnerable to her, and she realized the power this gave her. He had revealed the motive behind his proposal. But how do we stop him? She asked. There was still more to discover.
We expose him, Marco said. How? He sighed.
I don't know yet, he said finally. But I do know this, Carmilla. I will protect you. He was hiding something. But what?
And why?
Chapter 14. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. Marco's declaration of protection, while reassuring, felt incomplete. Isabella sensed a lingering hesitation, a subtle withholding of information that gnawed at her. He had revealed the core of the Bellini family's motivation, the bitter root of the feud, but she suspected there were still layers of deception, hidden truths that he was reluctant to share. Marco, she said, her voice gentle but firm, her gaze unwavering. You're still hiding something. I can feel it. He looked away, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards of the safe house. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration, of inner turmoil. It's difficult, Isabella, he said, his voice evasive. It's dangerous. We're already in danger, Marco, she reminded him, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. The truth, whatever it is, can't be worse than what we're already facing. He sighed, a sound of resignation, of defeat. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else. Something that looked like shame. It's about my father, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. About the circumstances of his death. Isabella leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. This was it, the missing piece of the puzzle, the hidden truth that she had been seeking. What about him? She prompted, her voice soft but insistent. The story, I told you it's the official version, he said, his voice hesitant. The version that everyone believes. The version that my uncle wants everyone to believe. But it's not the truth? Isabella asked, her voice a low murmur. He shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. No, he said, his voice choked with emotion. It's a lie. A carefully constructed lie. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of unease settling over her. What was the real truth? And why had it been buried for so long? My father, he wasn't a saint, Isabella, Marco continued, his voice filled with self-reproach. He made mistakes. He was involved in things that were not honorable. What things? Isabella asked, her voice gentle, urging him to continue. He was gambling, Marco said, his voice barely above a whisper. Heavily. He owed a lot of money. To dangerous people. Isabella felt a flicker of understanding, a glimmer of light illuminating the dark corners of the past. This was a new perspective, a different angle on the story she had been told. And your uncle he knew? She asked, her voice low. Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a bitter resentment.
He knew everything, he said. He used it.
He manipulated the situation. He orchestrated my father's death. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He killed his own brother? She asked, her voice incredulous. He arranged it, Marco corrected, his voice tight. He made it look like an accident. He used my father's debts as leverage. As an excuse.
But why?
Isabella asked, her mind reeling, trying to comprehend the depths of Giovanni's depravity. Why would he do that? Power, Isabella, Marco said, his voice filled with a cynical bitterness.
Control.
He wanted to be the Don. He wanted to rule the Bellini family. And my father, he stood in his way. And your father, he wasn't killed because of my father? Isabella asked, her voice trembling, her own family history suddenly cast in a new, unsettling light. Marco shook his head, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. No, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Your father, he was a scapegoat. A convenient excuse. A way to deflect suspicion. Isabella felt a wave of relief, a surge of something akin to gratitude. Her father, he wasn't a murderer. He had been framed. He had been a victim, just like Marco's father. But why are you telling me this now? She asked him. He had every reason to hate her family, every opportunity to use this information against her. He stared at her, directly. Because I trust you, Isabella. And because I was wrong. About so many things. The truth was out. But now, the question remained, what would they do with it? Chapter 15. A pact sealed in shadows. The revelation of Giovanni Bellini's treachery, the carefully constructed lie that had fueled the feud for decades, hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed down on Isabella and Marco. The truth, while liberating, was also terrifying. It exposed the depths of Giovanni's depravity, his willingness to sacrifice his own brother for power, his ruthless ambition that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. Isabella felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for justice, for retribution. Her father had been unjustly accused, his reputation tarnished, his life overshadowed by a lie. Marco's father had been murdered, his memory desecrated, his legacy twisted into a weapon of vengeance. We need to expose him, Marco, Isabella said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "We need to reveal the truth. We need to make him pay." Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "I agree," he said, his voice tight.
"But how? He's powerful, Isabella."
"He has connections. He's protected." "We have the truth," Isabella said, her voice laced with a fierce conviction. "That's our weapon. That's our strength." "The truth is not always enough, Isabella," Marco said, his voice filled with a cynical bitterness. "Power often trumps truth. Influence often silences justice." "We need evidence," Isabella said, her mind racing, searching for a solution, a way to break through Giovanni's defenses. "Something concrete. Something undeniable." "There's nothing," Marco said, his voice filled with despair. "He's too careful. He's covered his tracks. He's eliminated any witnesses." "There has to be something," Isabella insisted, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "Some record. Some document. Some piece of evidence that proves his guilt." Marco hesitated, his eyes searching hers, as if weighing the risks, assessing her trustworthiness. He seemed to be wrestling with an internal conflict, a struggle between his desire for justice and his fear of the consequences. "There might be something," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. A ledger. A record of my father's debts. A list of names. Of people who owed him favors." "Where is it?" Isabella asked, her voice urgent, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's hidden," Marco said, his voice evasive. "In a safe place. A place that only I know." "We need to get it, Marco," Isabella said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "It's our only chance. It's the key to exposing him." Marco nodded, his eyes filled with a reluctant agreement. "It's dangerous, Isabella," he said, his voice warning. "He'll kill us if he finds out." "We'll be careful," Isabella said, her voice reassuring, her hand reaching out and touching his arm, a gesture of solidarity, of shared determination. They made a plan, a daring and dangerous scheme to retrieve the ledger, to expose Giovanni's treachery, to break the cycle of violence that had plagued their families for generations. They would infiltrate Giovanni's villa, a fortress of secrecy and power, a place where he ruled supreme, surrounded by his loyal followers. They knew the risks were immense, the potential for failure catastrophic. But they were driven by a shared desire for justice, for redemption, for a future free from the shadows of the past. They were bound by a pact, a silent agreement sealed in the darkness of the safe house, a commitment to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. They spent the remaining hours of the night preparing, gathering information, studying the layout of the villa, planning their every move. They were a team, an unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of betrayal and shared pain, a partnership that defied the boundaries of their feuding families. As dawn approached, casting a pale light through the windows of the safe house, they prepared to leave, to embark on their perilous mission. They were armed with the truth, with a shared determination, and with a fragile hope that they could succeed, that they could finally break the cycle of violence and build a better future. Marco looked at Isabella, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and something else. Something that looked like love. She had a plan, but he knew that it was a plan with many risks.
"Ready?"
he asked. "Ready," she confirmed, knowing she was anything but. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm of Reckoning. The infiltration of Giovanni Bellini's villa was a meticulously planned operation, a delicate dance between stealth and audacity. Isabella and Marco, armed with the knowledge of the villa's layout and security protocols gleaned from Marco's fragmented memories and Sophia's subtly provided insights, moved like shadows in the pre-dawn darkness. The villa, a sprawling estate perched on a hilltop overlooking Florence, was a fortress of opulence and power. High walls, topped with razor wire, surrounded the property, guarded by armed men and sophisticated surveillance systems. But Marco knew of a hidden passage, a forgotten service entrance used long ago, now overgrown with vegetation and largely ignored. They approached the villa under the cover of darkness, the city lights twinkling below them, a deceptive backdrop of tranquility to the perilous mission they were undertaking. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of the awakening city. They reached the hidden entrance, a narrow opening in the wall, concealed behind a thicket of overgrown bushes. Marco produced a small, specialized tool, working quickly and quietly to disable the ancient lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage, the air inside thick with the scent of dust and decay. They slipped inside, the door closing silently behind them, plunging them into darkness. Marco produced a small penlight, its beam illuminating the narrow passage, revealing cobwebs, crumbling plaster, and the remnants of a forgotten past. They moved slowly and cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the villa, a labyrinth of secrets and hidden dangers. "The ledger, it's in my uncle's study," Marco whispered, his voice barely audible. On the second floor, at the end of the west wing, they reached a narrow staircase, ascending carefully, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their own ragged breathing and the occasional distant sound from within the villa. They reached the second floor, emerging into a long, dimly lit corridor, lined with portraits of Bellini ancestors, their stern faces gazing down at them, silent witnesses to their intrusion. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and beeswax, a suffocating aroma of power and privilege. They moved along the corridor, their senses on high alert, listening for any sound, any indication that they had been detected. They reached the end of the west wing, stopping before a large, imposing door, made of dark, heavy wood, reinforced with steel. "This is it," Marco whispered, his voice tight with tension. He produced another tool, working quickly and silently to pick the lock. The mechanism clicked, the door swinging open, revealing a spacious, richly decorated study. The room was filled with antique furniture, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, and a large, ornate desk, its surface covered with papers and documents. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke and expensive brandy, a testament to Giovanni's presence. Marco moved quickly to the desk, his eyes scanning the drawers, searching for the ledger. Isabella stood guard by the door, her hand resting on the small pistol concealed in her jacket pocket, her senses on high alert. "I found it," Marco said, his voice a low murmur of triumph. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with handwritten entries, a detailed record of debts, favors, and transactions. As he closed the ledger, a sudden noise from outside the study startled them. A voice, harsh and guttural, speaking in rapid Italian. "Check the study," the voice commanded. "I heard something." Isabella and Marco exchanged a look of alarm, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had been discovered. Marco quickly concealed the ledger beneath his jacket, his movements swift and efficient. He grabbed Isabella's hand, pulling her towards a large, floor-to-ceiling window, concealed behind heavy drapes. "We need to go," he whispered, his voice urgent.
"Now."
He pushed open the window, revealing a narrow balcony overlooking the gardens below. The drop was significant, but it was their only escape. Footsteps approached. "There's no time," Isabella said.
Marco nodded.
They had to jump. Chapter 17. Scars that whisper of survival. The drop from the balcony was perilous, a dizzying descent that sent a jolt of fear through Isabella. Marco, ever protective, positioned himself to break her fall, his body absorbing the brunt of the impact. They landed hard on the soft earth of the garden below, the breath knocked out of them, their bodies aching from the jarring impact. They didn't have time to recover. The voices from inside the villa grew louder, closer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn darkness. Marco grabbed Isabella's hand, pulling her to her feet, urging her to run. "This way," he whispered, his voice strained, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They scrambled through the manicured gardens, dodging ornate statues and sculpted hedges, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. The adrenaline surged through their veins, fueling their desperate flight, masking the pain of their bruised and battered bodies. They reached the high wall that surrounded the villa, the razor wire glinting menacingly in the faint light. Escape seemed impossible, the barrier insurmountable. But Marco, resourceful and determined, spotted a small, overgrown section of the wall where a climbing rose bush had partially obscured the razor wire. It was a risky maneuver, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. "Climb," he urged, boosting Isabella up, his hands supporting her weight. Isabella scrambled up the wall, the thorns of the rose bush tearing at her clothes, scratching her skin. She reached the top, her fingers bleeding, her body trembling with exertion. She looked down at Marco, her eyes filled with concern. "Come on," she urged, extending her hand to him. He started to climb, his movements agile and swift, despite his injuries. But as he reached the top, a shout rang out from behind them. "There they are!" A voice yelled, followed by the sound of gunfire. A bullet whizzed past Marco's head, narrowly missing him. He lost his grip, his body falling back towards the ground. Isabella screamed, reaching out to him, her fingers grasping at his clothes. She managed to grab his hand, her grip tight, her muscles straining with the effort. She pulled with all her might, her body trembling with the strain, her feet slipping on the loose stones of the wall. With a final, desperate heave, she pulled him up, his body collapsing beside her on the top of the wall. They didn't hesitate. They jumped down the other side, landing hard on the rough ground outside the villa. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, not stopping until they were far from the villa, hidden in the narrow streets of the awakening city. They found refuge in a small, deserted alleyway, collapsing against a crumbling wall, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling from the close escape. Isabella examined Marco's injuries, her hands gently probing his bruised ribs, her eyes filled with concern. He winced in pain, but he managed a weak smile. "I'm all right," he said, his voice hoarse. "Just a few scratches." Isabella tended to his wounds, using her scarf to stanch the bleeding from a gash on his arm. She then turned her attention to her own injuries, her hands trembling as she examined the cuts and bruises that covered her body. They sat in silence for a moment, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and relief. They had survived, but the ordeal had taken its toll. They were battered, bruised, and emotionally drained, but they had the ledger. They had the evidence they needed to expose Giovanni's treachery. Isabella looked at Marco, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to love. He had risked his life for her, protecting her, guiding her, saving her from danger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "For everything." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her, a spark of warmth in the cold, damp air. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that melted her defenses. "We did it, Isabella," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Together." But as they sat, catching their breath, and thinking about the next steps, a chilling thought began to creep into Isabella's mind. They had been too easily discovered. The guards had been waiting. The ease of the finding the ledger, almost too good to be true. Had they been set up? Chapter 18. The heart's silent confession. The chilling thought, the insidious suspicion that they had been set up, gnawed at Isabella's mind, casting a shadow over their narrow escape and the hard-won victory of securing the ledger. The ease with which they had found the ledger, the swiftness of the guards' response, the almost orchestrated nature of their pursuit, it all pointed to a trap, a carefully laid plan designed to expose them, to eliminate them. But who would betray them? Who had the knowledge, the access, the motive to orchestrate such a dangerous scheme? The obvious answer was Giovanni Bellini, but Isabella sensed a deeper, more complex layer of deception at play. She looked at Marco, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Something that looked like guilt? Was it possible? Could he have betrayed her again? Could he have been playing a double game, manipulating her, using her to achieve his own hidden agenda? The thought was unbearable, a dagger twisting in her heart. She had trusted him. She had opened herself up to him. She had allowed herself to love him. Could she have been so wrong? Could she have been so blind? Marco, she said, her voice trembling, her gaze searching his, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and accusation. We were set up, weren't we? He looked away, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the grimy cobblestones of the alleyway. He didn't answer, his silence a deafening confirmation of her suspicions. Who, Marco? She pressed, her voice rising in anger, her heart aching with a sense of betrayal. Who betrayed us? He hesitated, his body tense, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice evasive. We have the ledger. That's all that matters. It does matter, Marco, she insisted, her voice sharp, her gaze unwavering. I need to know. I deserve to know. He sighed, a sound of resignation, of defeat. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a raw, vulnerable emotion that she hadn't seen before. A confession, a plea for understanding, a desperate attempt to salvage a trust that was rapidly crumbling. It was Sophia, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Sophia? His own sister? The woman who had seemed so sympathetic, so understanding, so supportive? It seemed impossible, unthinkable.
But why?
Isabella asked, her voice trembling, her mind reeling from the revelation. Why would she do that? She's afraid, Isabella, Marco said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. She's afraid of Giovanni. She's afraid of what he'll do to us.
To the family.
She betrayed us to protect us? Isabella asked, her voice incredulous, struggling to comprehend the twisted logic of Sophia's actions. She thought she was doing the right thing, Marco said, his voice filled with a bitter irony. She thought she could control him. She thought she could prevent a war. But she put us in danger, Isabella said, her voice rising in anger. She could have gotten us killed. I know, Marco said, his voice filled with self-reproach. I should have seen it. I should have known better. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her, a complex mixture of anger, betrayal, and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to forgiveness. I'm sorry, Isabella, he said, his voice husky with emotion. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. Again. Isabella looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the manipulative charm he had once used to betray her. But all she saw was sincerity, a raw, vulnerable plea for understanding, a desperate attempt to reclaim a trust that had been shattered. She wanted to hate him, to blame him, to lash out at him for his sister's betrayal. But she couldn't. She saw his pain, his regret, his genuine remorse. She saw the man he truly was, beneath the layers of deception and family loyalty, a man struggling to do what was right, a man caught in a web of lies and betrayals not of his own making. We are going to get through this, she said, looking at him. He met her gaze. Are you sure? She nodded. I am. But in her heart, she knew that one question had still not been answered. If Sophia had set them up, how'd she known about Isabella's plan? Chapter 19. Embracing the flame of resilience. The weight of Sophia's betrayal, the realization that they had been manipulated, pawns in a deadly game orchestrated by Marco's own sister, hung heavy in the air. But amidst the anger and disappointment, a new resolve began to solidify within Isabella. She would not be broken. She would not be defeated. She would use this betrayal, this pain, as fuel to ignite her determination, to strengthen her resolve to expose Giovanni and break the cycle of violence that had plagued their families for generations. But one question lingered, a nagging doubt that gnawed at her. How had Sophia known about their plan to infiltrate the villa? The information had been shared only between her and Marco, a secret pact sealed in the shadows of the safe house. Could there be another leak? Another betrayal? She looked at Marco, his face still etched with guilt and remorse, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. She knew he was hurting, that he was grappling with the consequences of his sister's actions, with the weight of his family's legacy. "Marco," she said, her voice gentle but firm, her gaze unwavering. "How did Sophia know about our plan?" He looked away, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He didn't answer, his silence a deafening confirmation of her suspicions. "There's someone else, isn't there?" she pressed, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. "Someone else who knew. Someone else who betrayed us." He sighed, a sound of resignation, of defeat. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a raw, vulnerable emotion that she hadn't seen before. A confession, a plea for understanding, a desperate attempt to salvage a trust that was constantly under threat. "It was Alessandro," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella felt a jolt of shock, a surge of disbelief.
Alessandro?
Her own brother? The man who had always been so fiercely protective of her, so fiercely loyal to the family? It seemed impossible, unthinkable. And yet she remembered his words, the veiled knowledge, at the villa gates.
But why?
Isabella asked, her voice trembling, her mind reeling from the revelation. Why would he do that? He believes he's protecting you, Isabella, Marco said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. He doesn't trust me. He thinks I'm using you. He wants to end the alliance. He betrayed us to protect me? Isabella asked, her voice incredulous, struggling to comprehend the twisted logic of Alessandro's actions. He thinks he's doing the right thing, Marco said, his voice filled with a bitter irony. He thinks he's saving you from me. Isabella felt a wave of anger, a surge of frustration. Alessandro's misguided loyalty, his lack of trust, had put them in mortal danger. His actions had almost cost them their lives. I need to talk to him, Isabella said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I need to confront him. I need to make him understand. It's dangerous, Isabella, Marco warned, his voice filled with concern. He's unpredictable. He's volatile. I can handle him, Marco, Isabella said, her voice confident, her eyes flashing with determination. He's my brother. I know how to reach him. She stood up, her body aching from the ordeal, her mind racing with a plan. She would confront Alessandro. She would expose his betrayal. She would make him understand the consequences of his actions. And then, together, they would expose Giovanni. They would bring down the old guard. They would break the cycle of violence. They would build a new future. She looked at Marco, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that felt undeniably like love. He had been honest with her. He had risked everything for her. He had stood by her side through betrayal and danger. We'll do this together, Marco, she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. We'll finish what we started. We'll win. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her, a spark of hope in the darkness. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that melted her defenses. I know we will. Isabella, he said, his voice soft but firm. Together. They left the alleyway, stepping out into the morning light, their shadows stretching long and intertwined behind them, a symbol of their resilience, their determination, their unwavering commitment to each other and to a future free from the shadows of the past. They had one more stop to make before they could complete their mission. Isabella just hoped it would not be the final stop for any of them. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Isabella and Marco headed to the Romano family villa, the ancestral home where she had confronted Alessandro just days before, the place where his simmering resentment and misguided loyalty had reached a boiling point. The atmosphere crackled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. This confrontation would be different. This time, Isabella held the truth, a weapon forged in the fires of betrayal and near-death experiences. They arrived at the villa, the imposing structure a silent testament to the Romano legacy, a legacy now stained by Alessandro's actions. Isabella found him in the gardens, near the same spot where he had confronted her, his posture tense, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and something else. Something that looked like fear? Alessandro, Isabella said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. We need to talk. He turned to her, his expression guarded, his jaw tight. I have nothing to say to you, Isabella, he said, his voice cold and dismissive. Especially not in his presence. He glared at Marco. You will listen, Alessandro, Isabella said, her voice sharp, her eyes flashing with anger. Because you betrayed us. You almost got us killed. Alessandro scoffed, a derisive snort that echoed in the quiet gardens. I did what I had to do, he said, his voice filled with a self-righteous conviction. I protected you. From him. Protected me? Isabella challenged, her voice rising in anger. You put us in danger. You sided with our enemies. You betrayed your own family. I did it for the family. Alessandro shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. To save us from this madness. From this alliance with the Bellinis. The alliance is our only hope, Alessandro, Isabella said, her voice softer now, trying to reason with him, to make him understand. It's our only chance to end the feud. To build a better future. There is no future with them, Isabella. Alessandro insisted, his voice filled with a desperate plea. They're our enemies. They always have been, and they always will be. That's not true, Alessandro, Marco interjected, his voice calm but firm.
The feud, it was built on a lie.
A lie orchestrated by my uncle. A lie that cost both our fathers their lives. Alessandro stared at Marco, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice trembling. Isabella stepped forward, her gaze locked with Alessandro's. Giovanni Bellini, he killed his own brother, Alessandro, she said, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. He framed our father. He started the feud. He's been manipulating all of us. She pulled out the ledger, the evidence of Giovanni's treachery, the proof of his long-held secret. This proves it, Alessandro, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. This shows the truth. Alessandro took the ledger, his hands shaking as he examined the handwritten entries, the detailed record of debts and favors, the evidence of Giovanni's ruthless ambition. He looked up at Isabella, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. I didn't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing. I know you did, Alessandro, Isabella said, her voice gentle, her hand reaching out and touching his arm, a gesture of forgiveness, of understanding. But we need to work together now. We need to expose Giovanni. We need to end this. Once and for all. Alessandro nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. What do we do? He asked, his voice filled with a desperate plea for guidance. Isabella looked at Marco, a silent exchange of understanding passing between them. They had a plan, a final, daring gambit to expose Giovanni, to bring him to justice, to break the cycle of violence that had plagued their families for generations. We confront him, Isabella said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. We show him the ledger. We reveal the truth. We make him pay. They left the villa together, a united front, three figures bound by a shared purpose, a commitment to justice, to redemption, to a future free from the shadows of the past. Alessandro, finally, was on their side. The confrontation, they decided, would happen at the upcoming feast of San Gennaro, a large gathering of all of the families, a place with neutral territory and many witnesses. It was a risk, but it was the best way to finally achieve their goal. Epilogue. The Feast of San Gennaro, a vibrant celebration of Neapolitan culture and tradition, was in full swing. The streets of Little Italy were alive with music, laughter, and the tantalizing aroma of Italian delicacies. But beneath the festive surface, a tense undercurrent flowed, a silent anticipation of the impending confrontation. Isabella, Marco, and Alessandro moved through the crowd, their faces masks of calm determination, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They had chosen this public forum, this gathering of all the major families, as the stage for their final act, the unveiling of Giovanni Bellini's treachery. They spotted Giovanni across the crowded piazza, holding court amidst his loyal followers, his demeanor arrogant and confident, his eyes radiating a cold, calculated power. He was surrounded by his capos, his lieutenants, men known for their ruthlessness and unwavering loyalty. Isabella, Marco, and Alessandro approached him, their steps measured, their gazes unwavering. The crowd seemed to part before them, a ripple of unease spreading through the gathering as they drew closer to Giovanni. Don Giovanni, Isabella said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the piazza.
We need to talk.
Giovanni turned to them, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. He looked at Marco, his eyes narrowing, his lips curling into a sneer. Marco, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. I see you've brought your pet along. She has a name, Zio, Marco said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. And she's here to expose you. Giovanni scoffed, a derisive laugh that echoed through the piazza. Expose me? He challenged. For what? For maintaining order? For upholding tradition? For protecting our family? For murdering your brother, Isabella said, her voice sharp, her eyes flashing with anger. A hush fell over the crowd, a collective gasp of shock and disbelief. Giovanni's face paled, his expression hardening, his eyes filled with a cold, deadly rage. You dare, he sputtered, his voice trembling with fury. You dare accuse me of such a thing? Isabella stepped forward, holding up the ledger, the evidence of his treachery, the proof of his long-held secret. This proves it, Giovanni, she said, her voice unwavering. This shows the truth. Your lies. Your manipulations. Your murder. Giovanni stared at the ledger, his eyes widening in horror, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and desperation. He knew he was trapped, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before him, his power slipping away. He lunged at Isabella, his hand reaching for the ledger, his intent clear, to destroy the evidence, to silence the truth. But Marco and Alessandro intervened, intercepting him, restraining him, their movements swift and efficient. It's over, Zio, Marco said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. It's time to pay for your crimes. The crowd erupted, a cacophony of shouts and accusations, the truth of Giovanni's treachery spreading like wildfire through the gathering. His loyal followers, stunned and disillusioned, began to turn away, their allegiance crumbling, their faith in their leader shattered. Giovanni Bellini, the once powerful Don, the ruthless manipulator, was exposed, his reign of terror brought to an end. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. In the aftermath, the families, shaken by the revelations, began a slow, painful process of reconciliation. The feud, built on a foundation of lies, began to crumble, replaced by a fragile hope for a future free from violence and hatred. Isabella and Marco, bound together by their shared ordeal, by their unwavering commitment to truth and justice, found themselves drawn closer, their initial attraction deepening into a profound and enduring love. They had faced betrayal, danger, and near-death experiences, emerging stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected. Alessandro, humbled by his misguided actions, sought forgiveness, pledging his loyalty to Isabella and Marco, committed to helping them build a new future for the Romano and Bellini families. He knew now that blood was not necessarily thicker than water, that loyalty was not synonymous with hate, and that the truth was the strongest of weapons. The future remained uncertain, fraught with challenges and potential obstacles. But Isabella and Marco, together, were ready to face it, armed with the lessons of the past, with a shared vision of a better tomorrow, and with a love that had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and redemption. The city, once a place of fear, started to breathe again. And Isabella, finally, felt she could do the same. The end.